Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We will get started in about 5 minutes. Appreciate you being prompt. Hello, those of you just joining us, welcome to today's training session. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Just going to give attendees a couple more minutes to hop on here. Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Azure University 101 from Burwood Group. I am thrilled to welcome you all to the session today. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Colleen Berry. I'm the Marketing Director at Burwood Group, and I will be your host for today's session. So, as I said, our topic is Azure University 101. This is a 3-hour virtual training course about Microsoft Azure administration. We are thrilled to have so many of you join us on the call today. It looks like we have a great full crowd here to learn more about the building blocks of Azure. So if we pop to the next slide, you can see our agenda for the next 3 hours here. We'll start with general cloud concepts and then get deeper into Azure throughout the session. You can also see here that we've allocated 2 15-minute breaks over the course of the next 3 hours. This is a lengthy webinar training. We appreciate you giving our time today, and we want to make sure that we give breaks, frankly, not only to you, but to our wonderful speakers today. So watch for those. Please listen for me popping in to announce those breaks. And then to spice things up on each of the breaks, we will be asking a quick trivia question based on the training content and giving away a Burwood Group swag package to a couple lucky randomly drawn winners. So please keep an eye out for those. Before we dive into the content, just a little bit about us. Burwood Group is an IT consulting and integration firm headquartered in Chicago with offices and employees across the U.S. We help our clients to modernize IT infrastructure with cloud, automation, and collaboration technologies. And as a Microsoft Gold partner, we are especially interested in helping our clients maximize their Microsoft investments with Azure Public Cloud. In addition, before we get started, I'd like to briefly thank our sponsors, Microsoft and Citrix. So thank you to those organizations for helping us to put on this event today. A couple quick housekeeping items. 3-hour session. We are recording today's session. Following today's webinar, we'll make sure that all of you receive follow-up emails with your Grubhub credits as well. So thanks all for joining us. If you have any questions throughout, you're welcome to use the chat or QA window on the right side of your WebEx browser, and we will get to as many as we can. We definitely welcome lively participation. So if you all use the chat and QA to ask questions, I will jump in and interrupt our presenters to get those answered for you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and meet our presenters. I'd like to introduce you to Chris and Josh, our Burwood Group trainers for today. So gentlemen, please introduce yourselves and take it away.
Thanks, Colleen. My name is Chris Pereira. I'm a senior consultant on the cloud and network team. I've been in the IT industry for a little over 20 years now. I've been at Burwood for 6 years, and the past 8 years I've spent working pretty exclusively in Azure, starting off with their SaaS applications like Office 365, and then moving more into Azure infrastructure and helping our customers move their workloads into the cloud.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. I'm Josh McAleer. I am a senior consultant here on the Cloud and Data Center team. Work very closely here with Chris. I am an Azure Solutions Architect and have been working with the Microsoft stack Azure for the last 10 years at least. So have a lot of knowledge with helping companies establish the strategy to migrate to the cloud, help them deliver and be successful when moving to the cloud, and then also establishing that governance and security to make sure that the cloud doesn't get out of control. So look forward to today's presentation.
Thanks, Josh. So this is what we're going to cover today, today's topics. We're going to start out with some cloud fundamentals. These are subjects that you'll find in all cloud platforms like Azure, GCP, talking about AWS, so cloud models, cloud platforms, and cloud terminology. So just get some fundamentals down, get you comfortable with the cloud topics and terminology. And then we're going to walk into Azure fundamentals, talk about some of the details about Azure, like subscriptions, regions, availability zones. We're going to touch on resource groups, what these are, some RBAC, some role-based access controls, and how to apply security to your Azure deployment, your Azure tenant. We're going to talk about compute services, network services, storage and database services, and then we're going to touch on a little DevOps at the end. We're going to go through these topics, but as Colleen mentioned, if you have questions during the presentation, throw them in the chat and WebEx, and Josh and I will stop and answer your questions as we go along. We typically don't wait to the end. We'll just answer them as you ask them. So please participate. These are topics that we find a lot of our customers are interested in, particularly in a fundamentals class or a 101 webinar. If there's a question outside even of what we're covering here that you have a curiosity on or would like to get something answered, please don't hesitate. Don't be shy. Throw the question right into WebEx and we'll answer it for you. Okay, so let's get right into it. Cross-cloud terminology. So these are the terms that you might see across Azure, AWS, and GCP, which is Google's cloud platform. And within Azure, when you set up a network, it's called a VNet. With AWS, it's a VPC, and also with GCP, they also call that a VPC. Although the terms are different, the concepts are pretty much the same. So if you're looking at Azure and you're deploying a network, if you go to GCP and deploy a similar network of VPC, they're going to ask you the same things that Azure is going to ask you. You know, what subnet do you want to apply? What's your IP addressing range? Things of that nature. And then, supply some security around that network as well. So there's a lot of commonalities between Azure, AWS, and GCP. Although the terms are slightly different, the concepts are pretty much the same. So, for example, your hybrid connection, you have an express route with Azure, AWS, that's called a direct connect, and a cloud interconnect for GCP. One thing they do all have in common is a tag. We'll talk about tags during the presentation. It's part of our governance model when we go in and we look at spinning up resources in the cloud. When you create a virtual machine in the cloud, it's just sitting there. It needs some kind of identity. We use tags to give that virtual machine an identity, whether it's supplying a cost center to that virtual machine or the name of the person that spun it up. Well, however you want to do those tags, that are really important, and we'll get more into that as we get into the presentation here. So cloud terminology, some differences, but concepts the same. So if you look at cloud models, and perhaps you've all seen this, but this is a sort of a side-by-side comparison between what we kind of call legacy, your on-prem, everything's on-premise. You're managing it all. Infrastructure as a service, you can see there that you're managing the OS, the applications and the data. Microsoft is taking care of your servers for you and your networking. Platform, Microsoft taking care of everything, and you're bringing applications and data. And then software as a service, Microsoft takes care of everything. So this is sort of a side-by-side, and we'll get into each one of these in the next coming slides.
Hey, Chris, I'm going to jump in. We already have a question in the chat, which is awesome. From David, do you know how long until Citrix and VMware are going to force cloud-based management?
As far as forcing cloud-based management, I would say majority of those management planes are going to reside where your infrastructure resides. So when looking at Citrix as far as what they have to offer within Azure, Citrix recently partnered with Microsoft to own that control plane for Windows Virtual Desktop. So actually you can go to Citrix and still use your licenses with them, but essentially you're using the Azure backend for compute and networking and whatnot. So it's a very, I shouldn't say very easy migration, it's an easier migration with Citrix partnered with Microsoft to get from on-prem to Windows Virtual Desktop. Now, as far as VMware, vCenter is pretty much always going to live right next to the cluster that it's controlling. Microsoft does offer two different VMware services, one of them being, we'll call it AVS 1.0, and then the other one being 2.0. So 1.0 is utilizing Cloud Simple, which is a service that Google recently just bought. So Microsoft has been really focusing on bringing VMware into Azure and has just recently partnered with VMware within the past couple months to offer you VMware in Azure. So essentially what you're doing is Microsoft is standing up VMware clusters. You're getting vCenter servers, NSX, all that good stuff. You have full control over that, and that's where the management is going to come from when dealing with anything in the cloud.
Thanks. Thanks, David. That was a great question. Appreciate that. So let's start out, as I said, we're going to get into these here. So infrastructure as a service. So typically when our clients are moving into Azure for the first time or getting their feet wet with Azure, infrastructure as a service is a really good lift and shift way to get into the cloud. You're really, you're moving your virtual machines or your compute from on-prem, and you are spinning up a Windows or Linux server in Azure, and then loading your applications and your data on those computers, on those servers. So really easy way to get into Azure and get your feet wet and get going. IaaS is a great introduction to it, and very easy to do. Platform as a service is a little more advanced. We're talking about serverless compute, and as in the initial slide there showed you, Microsoft is taking care of everything. Now you're giving your DevOps and your application teams the opportunity to log into that serverless compute cluster and then just load their applications and load their code. So platform as a service, again, Microsoft is taking care of everything for you, networking, compute, all of it. You're just bringing your code and laying it on top of that platform. Software as a service. As infrastructure as a service, software as a service is also something our clients do right away. So this is migrating off of that Exchange service that you have on-prem and moving into Office 365 or spinning up Teams and Dynamics 365 or a combination of all three of those. This is Microsoft taking care of the back end, the networking, the compute, everything. All you are doing is purchasing a license for your users and having them log in and access their email, Teams, file shares, Dynamics, which could be an ERP system for you, a database for you. Again, Microsoft taking care of everything. You are just purchasing the licensing. So if we think about this, if the cloud platforms are confusing or complicated, or or you're new to that, if you think about it as pizza as a service, so traditional on-prem would be akin to your pizza made at home. You're taking care of everything. You've got the cheese toppings, the oven, the electric gas, soda, the dining table. That would be your traditional on-prem model. Infrastructure as a service, pizza dough, tomato sauce, toppings, and cheese, they're taken care of for you. You're buying that piece of it. You're taking care of the dining room table, soda, electric, so you're going to cook that, the oven, fire, whatever. And then platform as a service, everything's taken care of for you. You're supplying the dining room table and the sodas, and then there is software as a service, which is the equivalent to dining out. So we find this helpful in the cloud model to just go through this and show you sort of another perspective of how that might look. So which model do you choose? That can be a complicated answer. A lot of our clients and a lot of things we see is maybe all of the above. A lot of our clients still have a lot of on-prem data, and that's going to remain there for a long time or, in perpetuity. IaaS, you're going to manage everything but the hardware here, and you may do a combination of that. So you might have an on-prem database with servers and SQL servers on-prem, but you may have a few VMs that you spun up in Azure, and you're doing a combination of that. And you've connected your Azure to your on-prem. Now that Azure becomes an extension of your current data center. And then PaaS, you focus on being a dev rock star, as we say. So you may spin up some PaaS after you get your feet wet with the IaaS and the SaaS. PaaS may be your next iteration of your cloud platform, and that again. Microsoft taking care of all the compute and networking and storage for you. You're just supplying your application. So we see a lot of our clients doing 1, 2, and 4, and then after a year or two, and they're getting accustomed to Azure and how everything works, might venture into the PaaS arena. So Burwood team cloud point of view. So what we try to focus on when we're working with customers that are going into Azure are three things. First, security, governance, and cost management. So before you stand up assets in Azure, you want to make sure that, and I'll give you an example. So when you go to create a virtual machine in Azure, the Azure catalog is wide open to you. So you go and you create a VM, and now it's going to ask you, what size do you want that VM? If you're not controlling the purse strings, somebody could spin up a VM that has 14 CPUs and a lot of memory, which can be very, very expensive. So one of the governance things that we do is put some guardrails on that Azure deployment and say, we're going to limit the amount of SKUs that are available to someone spinning up a VM. And we do that through governance. Security Center is another thing that we focus on in Azure. making sure that your deployment is secure, or if you have any regulations that you need to accomplish, like HIPAA or PCI. We focus on that before we do any asset delivery in Azure, and then, of course, cost management. Can you cover cost management? You want to talk a little bit on that?
No problem. So cost management is a big piece of governance. Like Chris just mentioned, it is very easy to go in there and stand up a virtual machine that's going to cost you $5,000 at the end of the month when you don't even think about it, right? It's running, and all of a sudden you get the bill. Most of the projects that we're going into these days as far as Azure governance is a lot of companies doing the lift and shift model where they got to get out of a data center by a certain time, or, server hardware is end of life. So we're just doing this major lift and shift into Azure, and then all of a sudden they start getting bills for that, and it keeps on going up every month, and they just don't know where to start. So that's where the governance and cost management really comes into play. And just talking about cost management, there are plenty of ways to save money within Azure that a lot of companies don't take advantage of, as in bringing your own SQL licenses, bringing your own Windows licenses, reservations for how long you're going to keep those machines around, 1 to 3 years. Moving any of your IaaS resources into PaaS. That will save you a lot of money because you're not running full VMs, you're just running single databases as a service, basically. So, like I said, we see a lot of companies doing that lift and shift model, getting themselves into a hole and not really knowing how to get out or setting up proper management after that fact as well. And that's where governance comes into play with policies, blueprints, as Chris said, guardrails that would be put into place. So we want to make sure that you're set up for success when moving into Azure.
Azure does have a lot of cost management tools, cost analysis that you can take advantage of as well. They really want you to control your costs. They don't want you getting a surprise bill at the end of the month. They want to help you have visibility into what you're spending. And so things like in the cost analysis, you can set up budgets for your organization and get alerted when you get to 50% of that budget so that you know what's happening. And it also has a predictable measure to it. You can see, based on your usage or your consumption, where you might be in 3 months from now. So a lot of tools to make sure that your deployment is safe, you have governance there, and you have some cost management. I'll take the Azure.
Yeah, so Azure overview. So when looking at Azure, when looking at 365, Teams, OneDrive, all of those good online services that Microsoft has to offer, you're essentially not just moving into one service. And the reason we bring that up is a lot of companies have migrated to Office 365 and think that they do not have an Azure presence, when that's false. So essentially the way that works is Azure Active Directory is your source of users, right? That is your main directory across all of the services that Microsoft has to offer. So when we're doing, let's say, a Teams deployment, we're actually setting up policies within Azure Active Directory to control what's happening within Teams, to control what's happening within Office 365. So just do know that when you are migrating into these individual services, you are migrating into the Azure Active Directory kind of umbrella there. So we want to make sure that you establish that governance and security within Azure, so that way you know that you have control over across all of those services. And Azure Active Directory is the main key player in all of this.
Yep, and I will add too that with your on-prem Active Directory, connecting into Azure is one of the first things you're going to do. So when you establish an Office 365 presence, and maybe some of you have done this, maybe not, when you go to establish the Office 365 presence, you want a seamless experience for your end users. So you'll set up something called an AD connector or ADFS. It's a federation into Azure. This extends your on-prem Active Directory or the database that your users are using to authenticate to their on-premise applications, extends it into Azure, into Office 365. When you do that migration, it should be very seamless for your end users. Their on-prem Active Directory account is associated with an Office 365 account that's delivering their mail for them. So extending that into Office 365 and then further extending that into Azure Infrastructure can allow you to assign permissions to people from their on-prem Active Directory to allow them to do things like spin up VMs, spin up VNets. You have to have permissions to do that, and Azure Active Directory is an extension of that on-prem AD service. So if you're wondering how to get started with all of this, so we have some tips for you. I'm going to pause there. It looks like we might have a question. Kelly?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Question in the chat. Does Azure advise on ways to save money that maybe as a new user I might not be thinking about?
Absolutely, yeah. So Azure, like Chris said, Microsoft does a really good job at advising you on how things should be changed within your Azure environment, cost savings, etc. So one thing that Azure has to offer is the Azure Advisor, right? So it's actually a module built into your Azure portal that monitors all of the resources within your tenants. And so it will give you all of the cost savings that you could potentially do as far as, hey, this VM hasn't been utilized above 5% for the past 2 months. You're overpaying for this, and you could actually downsize this machine and save, so much money. So there's actually a single pane where you go into, and it will give you a yearly cost savings just from doing the changes that the advisor is recommending. Same thing goes with Security Center. Security Center is another module within the Azure tenants, and that will also give you recommendations around security and also any type of governance or compliance that you need to follow. So Microsoft does a great job of letting you know every little thing that's going on, how you could save money, how you can harden your security, if Windows updates haven't been ran on a specific VM, and we help you establish the monitoring for all that and the alerting and the budgets and whatnot. So you're not actively having to go in there and monitor it every day. You're getting alerts for any of this that does come up. It's one of those where when you manage Azure, you spend a lot of time in the advisor, in the Security Center, because that is providing you the second set of eyes, if you don't have it, that you would typically have in like on-prem infrastructure.
Couple of tips I could give you. So one is, and one of the things that the advisor will show you is this VM being used after 5 o'clock, so off business hours? If it is, you can actually set that VM up and schedule it to shut down and restart in a certain time frame. So that might be, I don't know if that's something you've thought about, but absolutely you can do that. We see a lot of our clients spin up VMs and leave them on all night. You can easily shut them down and save a lot of money that way. The VM is shut down, you're really not paying for anything but storage, which is pretty cheap from the VM. So that'd be a tip there. We looked at PAS. PAS is a very inexpensive way to shift an application from a server on-prem into a serverless compute. PAS is less expensive than infrastructure as a service. So if you're looking at migrating workloads, PAS would save you money and have that application operate just as it did on-prem or on a VM. So a couple tips there, maybe something to look at. I don't know if that's something that you yourself considered, but yeah, those are two big ones that we look at when trying to save some money in Azure.
Great. Thanks, guys. And I do have another question here. Are there different levels of storage and optimized compute in Azure?
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to get to those in the slides, but short answer, yes, many different levels. There are levels of high availability that you might want to look at, and we'll get into that when we get to the storage section. But if we get through that and we haven't answered your question, hit us up again and I'll make sure that we get that answered. Great. So getting started with Azure, what are some of the things that you might want to do? Well, the first thing I did was I signed up for a free account. This is something that you can do in a matter of about 10 minutes over a cup of coffee. We recommend that everyone do that. You don't have to use your current email address. You can set up an Outlook.com address, go to the portal, sign up for a free account. They're going to ask you for a credit card, but they're not going to charge that credit card. So you've got 12 months and $200 to play with. Spin up some resources, get some VMs going, try some PAS, try Security Center. Do some things, and actually Azure does have a lot of great guides. So if you go into Microsoft and you just type in how to set up an application gateway, they have a lab for you to follow. So what I would do if you're interested in learning about Azure, you're new to Azure, or there's even something that you've been in Azure for a while and there's something you want to try, like that application gateway or a WAF, go ahead and sign up for that free account and give it a shot. The next thing we would say is work with your organization to establish a tenant. we say work with your organization because if this is done in a silo, it can cause problems later. It's very difficult to change the name of your tenant. If you go out and sign your organization up and they're not happy with the name, you have to create a new tenant and then shift any workloads that you've had over. It's very difficult to do. So really coordinate with your organization and make sure everybody's on the same page. Sign up for Office 365. This is free. I mentioned that Azure AD connector that you can stand up. If you transition users into Office 365 or Azure Active Directory, there's no charge until you sign them a license. So these are all things that you can do without being charged. I feel sometimes clients are afraid to get this part started. They don't know how much it's going to cost. Well, it's free until you actually start assigning licenses. Like I said, set up an Azure AD connector and sync some users. If you have a lab, I would suggest doing that first just to get accustomed to it, know what the screens look like, know what your options are, set up a subscription on the Azure side. So Office 365 and Azure Infrastructure are two very different services. Although they're sort of together in the same tenant, Office 365 is SaaS, and then Azure Infrastructure is more your IaaS, PaaS, things of that nature. So you want a subscription for that to get some workloads running. Again, setting up a subscription is absolutely free. You should do it. A tenant, Burwood, Azure University. I find that our clients have got a lot out of this, and if you're really new to Azure, I think there's something for you. If you've been in Azure for a while, I think also there's some tips and tricks that we talk about within this presentation I think is helpful as well.
Yeah. Following up on that, another kind of secret that a lot of companies don't know about is that if you have a MSDN subscription or a Visual Studio subscription, you actually get some Azure licenses for your users. So it depends on which EA, which agreement you have, but you can assign that license to a user, and then they would get a free $150 every single month that's recycled for you to go in there, build out a lab and whatnot. So I highly suggest looking to see what subscription you have, see if those are available, and get those set up there. And then another thing is that the Burwood University, we do a much bigger university, typically on-prem with your department heads, with your whoever's in the department. So this is kind of a slimmed down Burwood University due to the time, but typically we would come on-prem for a full day, and then the last half of the day would include all lab-based work. So we would actually give you access to an Azure tenant, have you go in there and set things up like what we're going to talk about today.
Additionally to that, if you do not have a tenant, as part of that Azure University, we will help you set one up. We'll even help you get your VPN established and get your networking set up so that you can actually start to deploy resources and have your on-prem talking to your Azure deployment. In addition to what Josh mentioned about the larger Azure University, we also have a governance university as well. So we dedicate an entire 2 to 3 days working on your governance and your policies and your tagging and your naming conventions and all the things that you need to think about before you go ahead and start your organization-wide rollout into Azure. So all something that we like to talk about. We're very passionate about that stuff and just making sure that your Azure tenant is ready to go when you've got resources to spend.
Yeah, so as Chris just mentioned, we will help you through a series of workshops, really go through the Cloud Adoption Framework. So you'll hear that as CAF for short. So essentially what we want to do is help companies get up into cloud-based services. So the first thing we're going to do when working with anyone is really define the strategy of how and what you guys are going to be moving into Azure. So understanding why you need to do it. Typically, we're seeing it as we need to get out of the data center. Data center's too expensive. We have hardware that's end of life. We have applications that are out of date and need to be moved. Our contracts up in the data center. So there's a lot of different factors that come into play there, and we'll help you really prioritize what and how that's all going to move. And then, like I just said, we help you plan, help you come up with a readiness plan, the cloud adoption plan. Also, another big thing is that when adopting Azure, a lot of current IT folks don't have the knowledge to get in there and manage right away. So we're going to help you kind of establish that skills because we're still, when you're a networking person and you go into Azure, network is a little bit different, but we still want to make sure that we're having the network teams handle the networking, the storage team handles storage, DBAs are handling databases, et cetera. So that's kind of where that skills readiness comes into play. And then we get into the ready phase. So the ready phase is us essentially helping you establish all of those policies, those naming conventions, RBAC roles, and putting that into what we call landing zones. So when you're going through your migration, where are all these resources going to end up? And do we have the governance and security? That foundation is there for us to move our resources into it successfully. Same thing with the adopt phase as well. Help you come up with any type of migration plans for individual applications. Does this app make more sense to move it into a PaaS environment and move it out of a virtual machine? Maybe it's a virtual machine that's running SQL. Running SQL up in Azure is quite expensive on a virtual machine, so it doesn't make sense to move that into a PaaS where we're only paying for the database to be hosted. And then basically through all of that, you're establishing your governance of, benchmarks. You're making sure that it is becoming more mature as you go along. Microsoft is constantly releasing new controls that you can put into place, better compliance to be able to follow, and then also being able to manage that. Like I said, it's new to everyone when getting into Azure. Where do you go? How do you do it? Making sure that you guys are growing within Azure and not trying to essentially get out of it by moving into PaaS, moving into SaaS, eliminating some of those resources that would be a lot of overhead. So keeping the management up as well so it doesn't get out of control.
When you look at this CAF or Cloud Adoption Framework, it's not unlike what you probably already do today when you're rolling out an application. This looks and feels very much like an ITIL framework. So defining your strategy, plan, ready, adopt, govern, and manage, probably concepts everybody on this call are familiar with. Well, these concepts apply to Azure as well.
Yeah, so essentially when we are in the planning phase, these are all the different pillars that we're looking at when trying to get a company within the Azure realm of things. So starting off with identity and access management, as we said before, Azure Directory is the source of all user-based and groups and security groups. So we definitely want to make sure that we're extending your Active Directory from on-prem to Azure and doing it correctly, coming up with the right solution for you, rather that be ADFS, AD Connect, etc. Also, a big thing is identity, right? So multi-factor authentication. This is a couple clicks, and you could have multi-factor turned on for all of your users, for your admin users, whatever it be. And then getting into RBAC and then identity protection as well. So we'll get into RBAC a little bit later in the presentation and break that down a little bit. Identity protection is more so a add-on service that you would have to upgrade your license for if you weren't licensed for it. But that has a lot of play into Office 365, Teams, SharePoint, etc. And then we're looking at, data protection. Are you encrypting all of your VMs? Azure encrypts your managed disk. Otherwise, you would have to go into these VMs and make sure encryption is turned on via BitLocker. Same thing, you can store all of those encryption keys, other certificates, all within Key Vault, which is a secure vault that only you have access to. And then confidential computing as well. Getting into network security. So when you set up a virtual network, that virtual network is wide open. So we want to help you establish the security and the guardrails around that, rather that be setting up an ASG and NSG, which are network security groups. So essentially we can say, I want port 80 open to this specific server from this specific IP address. Application firewalls, application gateways. That is basically a firewall for your apps that comes with a load balancer as well. DDoS protection and then express route, really making sure that we're able to establish how you guys are connecting into Azure. Do you have enough bandwidth? Do you have the capacity there to be able to support it? And then threat protection and security management. I mentioned earlier, they do have Azure Security Center. You'll have anti-malware for Azure, and then also log analytics. There are a few other services that are in general preview as well, so they're not out to public quite yet, but they are really putting a lot of effort into compliance and security across the board.
So when you look at a couple of these items on here, out of the box, when you start your Azure deployment, you're going to have Azure Active Directory. You'll have access to an Azure Key Vault. That is not an extra charge. You will encrypt your VMs, your disks on your VMs with the Azure Key Vault. You can extend your certificate authority from on-prem into your Key Vault as well. Some other things you'll have, like Josh mentioned, out of the gate, VNet, NSGs. And so as far as free services within Azure, those are all available to you. Things like Security Center, Express Route, multi-factor authentication, those are add-ons that Microsoft charges for. All really important for you to have, but I just want to make you aware that some of these out of the box are free as part of your subscription to Azure, and others are an add-on paid-for subscription. Governance for the cloud. So when we think about governance, and we had mentioned that as one of our 3 big things we like to walk our customers through, we think about policies, blueprints, resource graph, management group, and costs. So policies, we want to make sure that when you spin up a resource, that you have the appropriate tags associated with that resource. You only are allowed to spin up certain resources based on the SKU, based on the cost. We want to control where you spin these resources up. So when you create a virtual machine, the world is your oyster. You can create that virtual machine anywhere in the world where there is an Azure data center, and there are a lot of them. So maybe as part of the policies, we want to limit where your administrators, your Azure administrators, the people that are spinning your assets up, where they can place these assets. Blueprints. Azure Blueprints is a great way to spin up resources in a consistent manner. So what are blueprints? You can go get a blueprint that will set up 4 VNets, 3 VMs, a Kubernetes instance. All it's going to ask you are the variables. What do you want to name these things? What SKU do you want on these? Like how large do you want that VM? What is the IP addressing that you'd like on the VNets? Well, once you plug all that information in and you hit go, the blueprint just spins up whatever it was part of that blueprint. So it could be multiple VNets with NSGs associated with them. Those are your network security groups, virtual machines, PaaS instances. So it's sort of that, one-stop shop for everything you need for your deployment for that application is within that blueprint. You're just providing the variables. Resource graph.
Yeah, so the other part to governance when looking at the 5 different areas is the resource graph, management group, and cost. So a resource graph is really going to allow you to get in there and query all of your resources. So this has a big key play when you're dealing with thousands upon thousands of resources. And when looking at the portal, it's just kind of a big mess in a way. So I'm able to go in there and set up a query that's going to say, I need to pull every machine that doesn't have this specific agent installed, or I need to pull, which machines are running at 90% all the time. I need to set up alerts for that. I want to figure out why logins are not working, where this is being blocked. So Resource Graph has a very, very big play into this. Essentially, that's how the advisor works. That's how the Security Center works. It's using Resource Graph in the back end to actually make sure that it's providing you the correct information. Management groups. So management groups are another very big key to when looking at governance. So a lot of people will typically just set up a subscription, apply the permissions to that subscription, and whatever happens under that's where they manage it all. So what a management group does provides the hierarchy. We'll get into this a little bit later here in the slide, but provides a hierarchy to where I could assign RBAC roles, I could assign policies at a higher level, and that's all going to trickle down to whatever is below that within the organization. And then you have cost. As we talked about before, cost is a very, very big factor into this one as well. This is where, you're not going to go out and spend thousands of dollars because you have a policy in place that says we're only allowed to spin up a certain SKU in this location and in a certain region. So we'll help you establish all of those and put those into policies.
Hey guys, jumping in with a question. Does MFA work outside of Azure for other things like a Duo would do?
Yes, yeah. So Azure can be your main source for all identity as you would like. The only time that we see somebody saying, I don't want to move full identity into there, as if they want to kind of spread out with a multi-cloud solution, a multi-cloud development. Maybe they have identity in a couple different places, resources spread out across different clouds. To answer your question, yes, Microsoft will provide everything that Duo has to provide as far as MFA and two-factor. You actually go in there in Azure Active Directory and set up your enterprise applications, assign users to that. You can assign certain RBAC roles to that, but it would act the same exact way. And then, of course, the Microsoft Authenticator is the Duo app.
Yep. Great question. I would also add to that the MFA requires an E5 license. So is that right? Is that accurate? Yep. So if you're on an E3, you'll need an E5 license. So if you've got certain users that require that MFA, you would apply the E5 to those users. They would get MFA as part of their Azure deployment, their subscription. Also, it works the other way too. So if you go into Azure Marketplace, Duo is there. So if you're using Duo and you want to deploy that in Azure, it's available to you. They've written, the application for Azure, and you can use Duo rather than Microsoft MFA as well. So it does work both ways. Thanks. Great question. Okay, so we're at our 15-minute break here. So we've got a question here, and we've got some Burwood swag to hand out. The question for you is based on our presentation. In which of the cloud models would you expect to find Microsoft taking care of the infrastructure and the customer end user responsible for just supplying the application code? So go ahead. You're going to put that in the chat, Colleen, the answers? Or?
Yeah, exactly, Chris. So if everyone wants to, if you know the answer or want to take a guess, pop open your chat. You'll see a little place to enter it. And in the drop-down, just select to host and send us your guess to the host here of the session, and then we will randomly select a correct winner. So this is our 15-minute break. For the first 10 minutes, we'll leave the question open. So if you think you know the answer, open your chat, select host, and then send your answer to us. We'll do that for 10 minutes. Total break will be 15. So let's take a 15-minute break now. I'll pop on at the 10-minute warning to remind you guys to submit any final guesses and also give you the 5-minute warning. So thanks everyone for hanging in with us. Feel free to still submit any questions during the break based on the first part of content here. We're happy to answer them when we come back. So 15 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, it has been 10 minutes. If you have any final submissions for the question on the board, please enter into the chat, send a message to our host in the next 30 seconds or so, and then we will close it and randomly draw a correct answer to win our Burwood swag pack. And then we have 5 more minutes here until we restart the session, so 5-minute warning. All right, we are officially at the end of our first 15-minute break. Chris and Josh, if you guys want to pop back on video as well, we are ready to jump back in. Chris, would you like to do the reveal on the correct answer here?
Sure. In which of the cloud models would you expect to find Microsoft taking care of the infrastructure and customer responsible only for supplying the application code? That would be Platform as a Service, or PaaS.
Awesome. That is right. Platform as a Service. Lots of you submitted that correctly, so thanks for participating. In the last few minutes, we did our random drawing on the back end, and our winner is Brock Nobish from St. Louis. So thank you, Brock, for submitting the correct answer and participating with us. If you can do the same thing in the chat, select host and shoot a note to our host on how she can get in touch with you. We'll make sure that you get your Burwood swag package. So thanks all. Let's jump right back into the content.
All right. Congratulations, Brock. Okay, Josh is going to cover Azure regions for us.
Yeah, so now we'll start focusing on the services that Azure has to offer, right? We were just kind of talking about cloud terminology, just getting you kind of that 30,000-foot level view of cloud and different models and whatnot. So jumping into Azure regions, Azure currently has, I believe as of yesterday or the day before, it's now 60 regions worldwide. All of those regions cannot be used by just your normal company, as some of them are DOJ, some of them are government for other countries, U.S. government, etc. So as I'm talking here, you can see how frequently they're adding regions to Azure to be able to provide you that global infrastructure. So why choosing a region is important. So anyone can log into Azure right now. I could go in there and I could say, I want to stand up a server in India. Would that make sense? No, it's all the way around the other side of the world. There's going to be a lot of latency, a lot of network jumps before getting there. We're going to notice a big performance decrease, and also the cost for me to get there is going to be a lot more. So what we're going to do is look at the region that we are closest to, so whether it be west, east, south central, north central, whatever it is, and then make sure that that region is going to be sufficient for you guys to use. Are the services available there? Is most of your offices located there? Would it make sense to have it in another region, more in the central U.S.? So there's a lot of different factors that play into that.
Thanks, Josh. General question on cost in the chat from Lawrence. Can you answer this? What is the range in pricing, low to high?
That is a tricky question. If you could in the chat possibly clarify more exactly which service you're talking about. Now, talking about general IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, right? So IaaS, you're paying for compute, you're paying for storage, for network, for everything. So that typically ends up being a lot more than going into a PaaS model where you're essentially just paying for that service. So if you have a database that needs to be hosted, it's going to be a whole lot less cheaper to do it in a PaaS than it is to go stand up a server, pay for all of that, and also pay for SQL cost. So it depends on which service you're really talking about when doing that. SaaS is typically subscription-based. So we have 300 users, we're paying per user, whatever that is, that comes with the services, and then they'll have, like 365 is a great example of SaaS where you're coming in on a subscription, and then you have all these different a la carte items that you can add on as well. So if that doesn't clarify your question, shoot it in the chat, and I'll be sure to get that answer for you.
One thing you could do, and we do this frequently, we get this question a lot, like how much does Azure cost? Azure or Microsoft has their Azure calculator. It's free service. Just Google Microsoft Azure calculator. They will walk you through the workload that you're interested in deploying. You're going to choose some options, like where you want this workload spun up, what kind of availability do you want for this workload, and then at the bottom, they'll go ahead and give you an average pricing per month on that workload. You could also calculate an entire application stack. So if you get in there, say that you want 4 VMs load balanced with a SQL backend and a application server in the middle. put all of your specs in, and then Azure will give you the cost of that deployment for you at the bottom. And then you can print that report in Excel or PDF and give it to whoever needs it. But that's a great way to find out, exact cost on stuff before you spin it out.
And following up on that, so part of the planning phase of the cloud adoption framework is basically setting up the quickest and easiest tool we go to is Azure Migrate or Movero, both owned by Microsoft. And we run these tools in your environment for, let's say, up to 30 days. They have hooks directly into Hyper-V and hooks directly into VMware. From running those assessments, we're able to tell you exactly how much that workload, how much that machine, how much that database is going to cost you every single month. Not including the bandwidth much, because that's constantly going to change. But as far as compute and storage, they can get down pretty close to the dollar on that. It will also tell you how much it would cost to move to PaaS, so you have that side-by-side comparison of if we just do this lift and shift rather than taking the time to refactor this app and move it into PaaS. Those tools and assessments will let you know all of that.
Great point. Subscriptions and management groups.
Yeah, so subscriptions are that's the main base of Azure essentially, right? So that is your billing control. That's how Azure handles its billing. So establishing the subscription strategy is something that's a lot of companies struggle with on how to do it. They think that, hey, we can just go have one single subscription for everything, which, yes, you can, but logically it just doesn't make sense. It makes management a lot harder. So typically with the subscriptions, you can go about it as having it be department-based. You could go about it having it be application-based, or, different regions are going to be different subscriptions. So there's a lot of different ways of going about figuring out how you're going to establish those subscriptions, making sure you don't have too many. I've been in a company before where they had 62 subscriptions and had no idea they had that many. They literally thought they had 4. That was they were here for governance, right? So that is exactly where that whole framework and guardrails come into play.
And think about subscriptions, as Josh was saying, as a billing account. So you're reporting on your cost analysis within that subscription. If you're in a particular subscription doing a cost analysis, it's difficult to see, in this case, if you're in subscription A, what's happening in subscription C. So if you think about it as your 30,000-foot billing view, that's how you should think about a subscription. So if you need another cost center or another billing that's separate from maybe your production, like we have here, you got your pre-prod and your prod, you might need another subscription for that. So how do you manage these subscriptions? Well, manage them through management groups, and this is a way for you in Azure to assign role-based access and policies and cost management and blueprints. You can do that within management groups. So what is management groups? It's that layer above the subscription. I might have one management group and then 4 subscriptions underneath it. If I assign myself network contributor role within that management group, that role, it's a hierarchy. So now I'm the contributor for networks on every subscription that is beneath that management group. It gives you the flexibility to move users and admins in and out of the RBAC and have it affect either your entire tenant or just a particular subscription that management group belongs to.
Thanks for pausing, Chris. Another question. I hope I get this right. What if any service we want to use is not available in the zone in which our application is?
So if the service is not available, so for instance, let's use West US. In West US, you don't have the availability zones available to you to use. So if you need availability zones, you actually have to go to West US 2 to be able to utilize that service. So unfortunately, if the service is not available in that closest region that you guys are next to, then you'd have to look at the next closest region and go to that and see if it's available there. Same goes with region pairs as well. When when you're pairing regions, you don't get to choose who you pair with. So if you go into West US 2, you're ending up in East US 2. If you go into South Central, you're ending up in Central. So there's things like that you definitely want to make sure you're paying attention to, because otherwise you're going to go and go, oh man, I got to move all of my resources to do this whole project to move it all when I could have just started right off the bat with it.
So you might have some storage and not have a region pair to provide that redundancy into the next region or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's when you're looking at region pairs, if you select locally redundant storage right off the bat, then if there is a failure, then nothing's going to happen with your storage. It's going to stay and it's going to go down. So you want to make sure you're selecting geo-redundant. So there's things like that that we actually talk about later on in the presentation.
All right, moving on to resource groups. So we talked about a subscription. That is your billing account. The way that you're going to manage that subscription, RBAC, and policies is through your management groups. Resource groups are, if you've got your management group here, subscription underneath it, your resource groups, that is the container by which all of your assets are going to go. So if you think about resource groups as just a management container for your VMs, your SQL database, your VNets, your NSGs. Resource groups can be designed in a lot of different ways. You can have a networking resource group, a compute resource group, or you can just put an entire application stack within a resource group. There's really no wrong way to do this. Setting up the resource group, you're going to pick a region, but that doesn't mean that the assets that go into that resource have to be in that region. It's just to establish the resource group. It's really a way of grouping. If any of you are PowerShell experts out there, if you were to PowerShell and put in a variable, the resource group name, you'll pull all of the assets within that resource group. So it's really a way to manage and view your assets within Azure. You can also look at billing too. I'll mention that. So when you're in the cost analysis center, there are filters that you can use to look at what certain areas of Azure is spending on. So if you've got a tenant, a subscription, a bunch of stuff out there, and you've got a resource group for, say, your app dev department, and you want to see what the spend is, if you filter on that particular resource group in the cost analysis, you're going to see their trends. You're going to see the assets within that resource group and what that is costing you.
Chris, a question related to billing. Are subscriptions only paid with credit card, or can they be processed through a company like an invoice?
A few different ways for subscriptions. One is credit card, right? Pay as you go. The other one is what a lot of companies do today is bake it into your EA. So you could have that EA-based or as I can see with the question there, invoice. So typically you would just email Microsoft support and say, I want to start getting invoices, and you'll start receiving invoices, and that's how you pay that way. So you have all three methods to establish those subscriptions. Yeah. But in order to get to the invoice method, you want to use a credit card first, and then open up the support ticket, and then they'll switch you over to invoice.
That's a great question. Thank you. So management groups to organize. So this is a picture of what that would look like. And if you look at the picture on the right there, we've got our management groups. You've got your corporate IT. Perhaps they're in charge of everything within your Azure subscription. We've got a few people in there that are contributors of everything within Azure, or owners of everything. So you want to, at the very top, that's going to be your top level admins there. And then as you move down through the management groups, we've broken them off into 3 more management groups that are below the corporate IT. Maybe you have people in development and you only want them to have access to that subscription and be able to spin up resources within those resource groups. Those little blue boxes below the keys there that represent the subscriptions are your resource groups. So depending on, and then maybe that development person that has that ability to spin up assets within the non-production subscription has read access to stuff in production. So they can see, the stuff that they're developing, getting moved over to production, and they can see how that's operating and at least have a view into what's going on. And then maybe you have QA, it's a whole different team. They've got access to staging and App One there, which is their resource group. So this is one model. This works really well, we find, because, as people move in and out of the organization, you don't have to go find them within all these subscriptions and find out what they have ownership to. It's done in one place, and that is called the management group. Anything to add there?
No, you covered everything. And there's multiple ways of going about this, right? If you go do a Google search on, the best practices for management groups and subscriptions, you can look at Microsoft documentation over the course of the past 2 years, and it changes over those years, right? And it's just the way that organizations operate, the way that they currently break down their workload. So this looks very confusing. It does sound confusing as well. But it's one of those things that we can help you establish during these workshops, is figuring out this foundational piece on how you guys should be operating and how you want to carry on, because you're setting yourself up for a lifetime in Azure, in the cloud. So you want to make sure that this piece is correct the first time around. Otherwise, it's a lot more work trying to get this established again.
I would add too, as you go through, and if any of you have been through it, a merger or an acquisition, and they have an Azure tenant and a subscription, and you're bringing that into your organization, having management groups sets you up for success for that. You don't have to worry about their RBAC. Once that subscription is underneath your management group, they're inheriting your policies and your RBAC and your roles. So a great, very flexible way to deploy Azure and bring other subscriptions in as needed as well. So Azure networking. So you go out and you get your free account, as we talked about. This, one of the first things you want to do before you really spin up any assets. You want to get some IP addressing going. So we do that through VNets and with NSG. So what are VNets? That is your Azure network. So you're going to spin up a VNet within your tenant, within your subscription. You're going to give that VNet a name, give it an IP address, and a subnet. And once you do that, when you go to spin up your VMs or your databases, everything needs an IP address these days. So you're going to assign that asset to a subnet within your subscription. And so we do that through VNets. NSGs are network security groups, and what that does is that's like a firewall. And it's not like a traditional firewall. It's more like if you've dealt with a Windows firewall or a Linux. It's based on code, but you've got easy drop downs, and you're opening ports and closing ports to certain IP addresses. So as you're adding assets to the subnets, they are looking at that network security group and seeing, okay, what ports are allowed in this subnet. The NSGs also apply to the entire subnet. So if you're blocking, a certain port, and you need that port open, it will be blocked by default when you put that asset in the subnet. So watch your NSGs as you're designing out your networks. Make sure that you are protecting your subnet with those firewall rules and those ACLs, but also that your applications can function. So you've got a VNet, and you've put a bunch of assets into it, and maybe it's an application stack that's sitting in that VNet. Well, now you find you need another VNet. So what we need to do here is peer these. We need them to talk to each other. So we do that through VNet peering. When you go to set up your two VNets, there is an option within the Azure tenant, within the setup of the VNet, to peer. And what it will do is you set up peering on one side, it'll go look for the VNet on the other side. And if the VNet is there, it'll establish that peering, and then assets within VNet B can now start talking to assets within VNet A. Anything additional there?
Nope, that covers peering. Yeah, so typically, a lot of the times when moving into Azure, a lot of companies are going to adopt the hub and spoke architecture, right? So that is essentially where we have multiple VNets, multiple virtual networks, with VNet peering between all of those networks, most of it coming back to a central hub. That central hub network has all of your connections from VPNs to express routes, also has a Bastion subnet, a DMZ subnet, So it's mainly all of your connectivity. And then from there, you would forward traffic to the individual VNets for, let's say it's a management VNet that has all the different management tools you need to manage the infrastructure. It could be a web VNet, so you have your web front end in there. Or you can break that down into individual subnets. So essentially, the way to keep security in place but have the connectivity is through peering, and then we would come in and set up the hub and spoke and be able to really just build that network out.
I would add to this hub and spoke, if you look at the diagram that we have here, if you need spoke 1 to talk to spoke 2, in this diagram you would need some kind of routing mechanism within the hub virtual network. So keep that in mind as you're looking at this. Otherwise, you would need to run a peer between spoke 1 and spoke 2. So in a hub and spoke, you either need some type of routing mechanism. There's lots of free ones in the Azure Marketplace you can spin up. There's some pay-for ones, but you need some type of routing done within that hub virtual network if you want spoke 1 to be talking to spoke 2 as well.
Yeah, so a few different ways of establishing connectivity into Azure, into Microsoft, is VPN gateways, so VPNs, IPsec tunnels, and then also express routes. So speaking on the VPN gateway, essentially what you would do is go into Azure and set up a IPsec tunnel between Azure and whatever firewall you guys have on premise or wherever you're going to. And that's all established via a VPN gateway. So we could go in there, we could set up to 30 VPNs, 30 VPN tunnels per subscription. If you need any more than that, then you would have to look at a different Azure service. But the VPNs, they have different SKUs, different levels of throughput. And then also, it really depends on the WAN connectivity that you have, which shows the performance in that VPN tunnel. And so a web application firewall. So a few different ways of protecting the resources that you have. One of them is going to be a WAF. So a WAF is protecting you from any type of, let's say, SQL injection, attacks coming from anything from outside of your perimeter or inside as well. So an application gateway comes with the web application firewall built into it, plus a layer 7 load balancer. So that's essentially, I go in, I state, this is the servers that live in my backend pool. This is the port that we're going to be load balancing via layer 7, and then I'm going to forward that there. So an application gateway has the WAF built in, or you can go and get a WAF by itself and just use it as a service like that. Load balancer, like I was just explaining now, it's pretty much all port-based. So pretty simple to set up. Essentially, we would get a public IP address with a public load balancer, or a private one would stay private without a public IP. And we would say any connections coming in on port 80, it's going to be forwarded to these specific VMs, and that would be your back-end pool. So very straightforward, fairly cheap to have in front of all your applications.
Question on the subnets. If two subnets need to talk with each other, then can we put those two subnets in one VNet?
Yes. Yes. However, those two subnets need to be within the network that you've established. So in VNet A, we have 10.1.0.0 at a 16. Your subnet needs to be within that address space, and then you can go ahead and create that subnet. So that's the only rule. Otherwise, you can have as many subnets, and you can carve up that network just as you would with your on-prem networking. So yes, absolutely. However, the only rule is stay within your IP address range.
Yeah, and when you're looking at segmenting those, typically Azure is going to yell at you if you have a subnet that does not have a NSG assigned to it, right? So typically you would want any subnet you create within a VNet is either going to fall into a general NSG that covers all of those subnets, or if you need to segment those, you would assign an NSG per subnet and then allow access between those with the ports that you would need.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And then we have a second question here. Can you guys explain the express route a little bit more?
We're getting there.
Great. Awesome.
got a load balancer?
Yeah, load balancer. So application gateway, I just talked about what the WAF was and how that lives inside an application gateway. This gives you a lot more control over how you're routing traffic. You can even get down to directory-based traffic routing. So you could have a general website, contoso.com, and then I want to route traffic. I want to have different protection for this directory, for this other directory. As you can see here in the image, it's showing it's going to an image pool, and it's using the images directory there. So an application gateway gives you a lot more granular control over a WAF and a load balancer. But typically for the application gateway, you are not setting those up like you would be setting up the load balancers in that much. You're doing 1 compared to you're doing 5 as a load balancer type of deal. And so a traffic manager. So traffic manager is a way of routing your traffic between different regions, different subnets and whatnot. So essentially what happens is that we have all of our traffic come into a traffic manager. That traffic manager is constantly doing health checks. So if it sees that in the graphic here that primary priority 1 is down, it's automatically going to route traffic to a different region for you. So essentially what we would do in an architecture design is you have all your traffic come into a traffic manager. You have your geo-redundant application that's located in 2 or 3 different regions, and traffic manager is constantly pinging. So if you have an outage, then it's automatically going to start routing that traffic to another region that is online for you.
Content delivery network. So say, for instance, we've started a company and we're providing Azure training video services. Well, and everyone across the globe is watching our videos. Well, what we want to do is deploy a content delivery network. What that means is we've got copies of these videos located in regions and data centers throughout the world. The content delivery network will detect the location of the person accessing the content or the videos and direct them to the closest data center available to that person. So content delivery network, it's a consistent mechanism for getting users as close to the data center that they're at to access whatever content they're accessing. Is something that Facebook would use, obviously, YouTube, anything that delivers content to end users. The delivery network is a way to make sure that the speeds are fast for the end user and they're getting good performance from that. So we talked a lot about some networking features and products within Azure. So if we just zoom out and take a 30,000-foot view and put it all together, we have a user, Cristobal, and he's in Madrid. And he's accessing our Azure training videos, but we need to take that content down and do some stuff on the network. And so we want to. His primary entry will be down for 4 hours. Well, that's where the traffic manager comes in, because we've loaded the content delivery endpoints into traffic manager when we went to set it up. Traffic manager is watching to see that that content is still available. Once it becomes not available, then traffic manager will take Cristobal's request and send him to the next closest data center available. In this case, it might be Singapore. So traffic manager is watching to see, is the content delivery network up? If it's down, we're going to shift that user over to the second best location for them. So that's kind of how those two items might work together. As we get into Chicago, you can see that we've deployed an application gateway. That's our L7 load balancers and our WAF. Then we have a load balancer that we've deployed to make sure that things are fast, things are moving quick, and we have some high availability. So if you've got some multiple VMs on the back end, our load balancer is watching for uptime on that. And the application gateway obviously is more application-centric, layer 7. Over on the bottom right, we have our VPN gateway. That is the connection to our on-prem to Azure and from Azure to on-prem, and that's something that we want to establish right away to get your organization talking in Azure. So take just a zoom out look at what we just covered. This is one of the ways it would be all connected in.
Yeah, so connectivity methods into Azure. So there's a few different ways to get connected into your Azure tenant. Can you operate an Azure tenant without connectivity from your office into it? Yeah, absolutely. but you're creating a lot of holes. Think of Azure as just another office that you guys are opening. So you wouldn't do that there, so no reason to do that here. So let's make sure that we get connectivity established as quick as possible. So a couple ways of doing that. Like I explained earlier, the IPsec VPN tunnel. So you can do a site-to-site tunnel, which is just your basic IPsec IPv2, or you can do a point-to-site VPN, which is getting your user's laptop connected into the Azure tenant directly. There are some gotchas as far as hardware providers for site-to-site, so just make sure that you do check that list to ensure that your hardware is capable of connecting into Azure. So another way of establishing that connectivity is via express route. So there's a few different ways that you can establish an express route to your infrastructure. One is if your infrastructure is in a data center, and it's a pretty big name data center, they most likely are a cloud exchange provider. So they already have the Azure pipe coming into their data center, and essentially they just need to drop that line into your rack and get you connected there. You can choose anywhere from 1 gig up to 10 gigs, but it's definitely a limit of who the provider is on that. Another way to do it is getting a circuit directly into Azure from your office, from your data center directly. Working with a provider who can drop that into your office and have that direct connectivity into that. And do keep in mind, the express route is the fastest and safest way to establish that connectivity. It's not the fastest when it comes to having to wait on providers. We all know how that goes, or new circuits. So that's really just pending on where you are. And then you can do as you get larger with your Azure deployment, and let's say you're a supermarket chain and you have 60 stores across the U.S., you're going to start hitting limitations when it comes to tunnels and express routes and whatnot. So that's when you look at another service, what Azure has to offer, which is virtual WAN, which kind of takes these two connectivity methods and puts it into a single module with global connectivity and different hubs across the U.S. that you establish connectivity to for latency as well. So those are all different options available for you to get connected into Azure. Like I said, do keep in mind express route is really pending on the provider you're going with. So it could take a week, it could take 45 days. So do keep that in mind. IPsec VPN, there's really no reason not to have it. Even in an express route deployment, we're setting up an IPsec VPN as your backup in case the express route goes down.
About 10 minutes for that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I would add too, with the co-location, say you're a core site, someone that has a cloud exchange. If you're putting workloads within that colo, that cloud exchange is a very fast entry into Azure. And then you talked a little bit about region pairs. Can you talk about cloud exchange and region pairs and how that operates in terms of like backup and high availability for?
Yeah, so essentially Microsoft has a global reach backbone that extends across all of the different hubs across the U.S. So when the Cloud Exchange sets up their connectivity in the Azure, it's full-blown high availability, the whole deal there. So you're going into establishing into their backbone, not essentially a service. So you're connecting into their edge, and then that edge is controlling where that traffic is going. So if you have a regional outage, that edge is going to forward that traffic to the other region. Another thing I forgot to talk about here, which is the last one, is getting in as far as like a SD-WAN type solution, right? So like I said, some providers are a little bit difficult to deal with, some hardware providers when it comes to IPsec VPNs, or somebody wants to extend their SD-WAN deployment into Azure. There are every hardware provider, I believe, nowadays offers a virtual network device. So, and essentially, so if you're talking about Meraki, we can go and put a virtual Meraki in there, establish the connectivity from all of our Merakis into the SD-WAN. Same with Citrix, same with all the big providers. So that is another way of getting connectivity into that. And that is all going across however you guys would have your SD-WAN or MPLS set up.
Awesome. I hope whoever asked the express route that covered it for you. But if it didn't, throw a question in there. We'll get it answered. So Azure Compute Services, a lot of options for you within Azure for compute services. And when you're looking at shifting workloads into Azure, here are some things to consider. Azure VMs, that is our IaaS, our infrastructure as a service. That's up in the upper left there. Everything down, lower right is going to be your PaaS. So you've got your Azure App Services, VM scale sets, provides elasticity, and some automation there. Azure container instances. You got Kubernetes stacks and Azure functions, and we'll go through those in the next few slides. So your virtual machines, again, IaaS, really simple way to get rolling. Go ahead and once you get your VNet established, spin up your virtual machine and IP it. You're going to select which operating system you'd like on this virtual machine, fire it up, and you're ready to go. So that's VMs, very easy to establish these, and go ahead and install your applications. Sizing your VM. So these are the different SKUs that you have available to you within Azure. And this goes along with some of our policies that we talked about. And this is something we keep a really close eye on. So heavy computational tasks, large memory usage, data storage, heavy graphics. So if you've got a department that's doing CAD or something of that nature, NV, NC machines, ND machines are probably for them. You may create a resource group for these machines and apply a special policy to them that allows them to spin these types of machines up, where everybody else would be on the A's and B's and D's, their general compute sizing for VM. So these are the various SKUs and what you might use them for, and then also keeping in mind, again, that governance and that policy, because there's a vast difference in the cost between these machines from a B to an H. Scale sets. So let's say that we've started an online shopping service and we're getting near the holidays and we've just shifted into Azure. Well, VM scale sets is a great way to deploy a virtual machine with your web app on it. As your customers are coming in and using that application through the web, Azure is monitoring that scale set. And as that workload gets larger and larger, Azure will actually add VMs that are identical to the one that you spun up. So you may start with one, and then around December, around Christmas time, you've got 25 VMs. In February or March, you're back down to 2 or 3, and then by June, you've got 1. So Azure does that automatically, and that service is called scale sets. Container instances. So this is your serverless compute, your PaaS. You may have heard of Docker images. What is this? Well, a Docker image is a nice way for you to deliver compute, networking, and storage to your application developers. So what are we doing here? Well, with a Docker image, we're asking the app dev person, well, what do you program in? Well, okay, I program in Python or whatever code they're using. You will select a Docker image for that, and then when they go and log in and start to deploy their code, it's like a virtual machine that's already been set up for them. They've got all the tools they need on that virtual machine. So a Docker image is a really quick way to deploy a container instance to your app dev department, really allowing them to get in and start working right away, not having to download all these tools and update tools. The Docker image takes care of all that for you. We have our Kubernetes stack. This is very similar to container instances, except it has a control plane. It's sort of a combination between a scale set and your container instances. And what it's doing is it's expanding your compute capabilities as the Kubernetes stack gets more and more busy with overhead from users. So really it's sort of a culmination of the scale set and the container instance here in the Docker image. It's got a control plane and it's got some back-end compute. And it's monitoring everything that's happening. So if you've got a node that's down, it's going to fail that node over and then create a new node that will work and put it as part of that Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, Azure Kubernetes, the actual service does a great job of really just reducing the complexity that Kubernetes brings and the operational headache and management that comes with it as well. All of that is pretty much offloaded to Azure. Azure handles all the critical tasks like health monitoring, maintenance, all that good stuff. So the other good part about that is essentially you're not managing the master, so you're not paying for that. So you're paying for the agent node. So that's definitely a cost savings when looking at hosting a full Kubernetes cluster rather than just managing the agents themselves.
Great point. Thanks. Azure Functions. So within every good deployment, you want to have some automation. You want to give your admins a break, and if there's anything they're doing, repetitively, Azure Functions is the way to go. So you can code Azure Functions within something like Visual Studio Code and deploy it to your Azure subscription. It does a lot of things. It could be monitoring an application for a certain event and then kicking out a log to a storage queue. So Azure Functions is something you want to do within your deployments to create some automation. Using Event Hub's Function app, you can write to a Cosmos DB. There's a lot of things, well, everything within Azure plugs into Azure Functions, and really just snippets of code for common tasks that you might be doing repetitively throughout the day or weeks. This is a great way to relieve yourself of that.
Yeah, and these don't just have to be used within the Azure environment, right? You can use these with outside applications, with outside services, and use these as ingestion points. So there's many different ways of going about functions.
And we're at our break. I'm going to go ahead and read the question for this break. Which Azure service would you deploy if your application required automated elasticity growing and shrinking as usage increases and decreases?
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So, second question, everyone. If you'd like to give it a shot, please open the chat panel, select the host dropdown, and send us your best guess. We'll draw a winner in about 10 minutes. So this is our 15-minute break. We will come back in 15 minutes. I will pop on again at 10 just to give you the reminder to put any final answers in the chat. So thanks, everybody. Quick break.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we are 10 minutes into our 15-minute break, so warning that we will be closing the trivia question in about 30 seconds or so. If you have any final suggestions or guesses, please pop them into the chat to the host. We will draw the attendee shortly, and then in 5 minutes, when we return, we'll announce the winner. So 5-minute warning, coming back in 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Our 15-minute break is officially up. So let's restart here. Before we do, we will give away the final swag package of the day. So just a reminder, that question was, which Azure service would you deploy if your application required automated elasticity growing and shrinking as usage increases and decreases? Chris and Josh, the reveal?
Well, Jeff had the most delicious answer, which was chocolate cake, and I appreciate that, Jeff. Thanks. However, the correct answer is scale set or horizontal scaling. I saw that some people wrote, so we'll accept both of those answers. So thank you.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Chris. We have done the draw, and the winner is Varma Jampana. Hopefully I'm getting that right, but Varma, congratulations. We'd love to send you a Burwood gear package, so please send a message in the chat to our host giving us your contact info. All right, and let's get right back into the content.
All right, congratulations, Varma. So I'm sharing my screen here. This is the, as we were probably talking through the presentation, I'm sure all of you went out and got your free account to Azure. If you did, you may see something similar to this. And I just wanted to show you what this might look like. So when you do establish that free account and want to get your feet wet with Azure, this is what it's going to look like. And what you're going to do is find a subscription that will be given to you by Microsoft. And if you go down to your resources, you can see that I've already gone ahead and created a VNet within that subscription. But if you haven't created a VNet and you just come in here brand new, what you want to do is go to your subscription, overview, resources, and you can go ahead and add a resource in here. And when you do that, it's going to take you to the Azure Marketplace, and you can see they've got some suggestions for you, some categories down the left-hand side. You've got some compute, containers, dev tools, IT and management tools, media, a lot of stuff in here to choose from. On the right, there's some more popular items that you might choose. Like I said, you want to start with a VNet. However, you've got some servers that you can deploy, web apps that you can try. And as I mentioned before also, Microsoft has a great guide. So if you want to try something, they've got labs for you to check out, and you can actually deploy those labs within your free account here. So as I'm searching the marketplace, I could do one of two things because I want to start with my network. I could either come down to networking, or I could simply type into marketplace VNets, which brings me to a virtual network. Oh, and by the way, you may see other things within the marketplace, like Cisco CSR. So they have a router in here that you can use. They've written it for Azure. You have to pay a subscription or a cost for that router. However, there are a lot of very popular vendors that have products within Azure that you can choose. For our case here, we'll choose the Azure out-of-the-box VNet and go ahead and create it. And as we go through here, you're going to see that it would like me to select a resource group. I've already created a resource group, RG Burwood AZU1001. And this VNet is going to need a name, so I'm going to go ahead and call it VNet 005. And as we talked about, you want to select a region. So I might put this in East US because these resources are going to be used by people on the East Coast. And now I'm over into IP addressing. You can accept the IP addressing that they suggest for you or create a new address space. I think we had a question about that earlier about the subnets. As long as your subnet is within that address space, you can create as many as you like. Go ahead and add a subnet. And I'm going to create a subnet name and a range. So I'm going to want to stay within my range. Service points. If you have storage or services that are going to be running in this subnet, you might want to select a service point like Microsoft Storage. And what that service point is, it's sort of this, I like to describe it as an underground tunnel for which that service communicates. So if you've got a lot of storage within your Azure portal, and it's all writing in the subnet. If you go ahead and create a service endpoint for that storage, it's a very fast way for storage to connect to compute within your deployment. I'm not going to select any services at this time. I'll select Add. Go to Security. I have some options here like a Bastion host or DDoS Protect or a firewall that I want to enable. I'm going to leave this all disabled.
And one thing to touch base on here real quick is this is something that we covered more so the security workshop per se, is getting into what these are individually. So the Bastion host, DDoS, and firewall. I'm sure most of you know what the DDoS and firewall would provide, but as far as the Bastion host, that is the most secure way of getting into a resource without directly opening up that resource to the World Wide Web. Essentially, you're creating a different subnet that Bastion host is living in. It's a jump box that's controlled by Microsoft. So you would remote into that jump box via the Azure portal directly from the portal, and then have access to that resource you're trying to get to. That is available for all virtual machines.
Thanks, great point. Next, we're going to go to tags. So tags are, that's what a lot of our governance is built on tags. So for a tag name, I might say cost center. And in that cost center, I might provide a value. Let's say I'm going to use marketing.
Yeah, and tagging is another big area where it really helps when dealing with any type of reporting, any type of billing, of who the owner is. You can create a tag for virtually anything and the value for that as well. So essentially what you want to do when going through the governance process is decide on which tags you're going to use and the values for those, and then create policies around that. So if the tag is required for every resource that is created, we want an owner tag on there, then we would create a policy that would state that. So you know that, hey, we're not ever going to have a resource that's created without knowing who the owner was who created that.
Yep, great point. And so I've got my tags, so I'm going to go ahead and review. And then Microsoft's going to run a validation on everything that you deploy within Azure, including our VNet here. So making sure that the validation for networking passes, some of the things they check is IP overlapping, things of that nature, maybe a naming convention that is not supported by Azure, that would fail a validation. But in our case, we are good. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create.
Yeah, and do keep in mind when you are creating the virtual networks, you're pretty much doing this once, right? If you ever need to change that virtual network, you're not changing it, you're creating a new one. So you definitely want to make sure that you're looking at all of your on-prem resources. If you have, 100 stores across the U.S., and making sure that you're not going to have any address overlap, or else you're going to have a lot of work to take care of later on down the road rather than just getting it separated. So like I said before, think about Azure as kind of opening up another office. You would set up that office with a VNet. You would put all the hardware in there. Think about it the same exact way.
Good point. So now my deployment is complete. I'm going to go ahead and go to my resource, and here it is. A lot of things you can do with this. Provide firewall, security, DNS servers. We talked about peerings before, so if I wanted to add a peer connection to my other VNet that I created previously, I can do that here. It's going to ask me to drop down the box, select the network that I want to peer with, and now I can connect my two VNets together, and any resources within those VNets and subnets can communicate. So now that I have my network, I can simply go back and create some virtual machines if I want. So within here, I can go ahead and add a virtual machine. And by the way, you're seeing the deploy resources a lot of different ways. So you can go in the marketplace, or you can use the shortcut from the home screen. You could even, if you want to, go ahead and use the CLI. If you're more of a command line, it's going to require you to create a small storage for those commands, because everything within Azure needs some type of storage. So if you go to the Azure Cloud Shell, you can deploy VMs there. If you're a PowerShell expert, you can deploy VMs and VNets through PowerShell. A lot of options for connectivity within Azure, not just the portal.
Hey, Chris, quick question in the chat. Can VNet be spanned between different regions?
No.
No. No. You're in your region. Yeah, so that VNet is going to stay in its region, and then the assets you deploy, they will also need to be in that VNet's region as well. So that's all the methods by which you can create assets and a little sample of what that might look like. And to get you started, if you get that free account or you go ahead and set up your organization, these are some of the initial things that you would do within the tenant. Okay. Josh is going to cover availability sets, zones, and region pairs, but I'll kick us off with the opening slide here. So if you're thinking about high availability for your resources and your assets, you start out with a single VM. One of the things about Azure, and maybe a misconception, is that that VM is protected somehow in the cloud. It's not. It's basically the same as if you created that VM on-prem. You need to set up things like availability sets, availability zones, or region pairs, depending on the type of high availability that you need for that resource. Availability sets. So if we look across these, we have our single VM, our sets, our zones, our region pairs. I'll go ahead and talk about sets. So this is, if you've been in a data center, a colo, if you look down the long line of racks within that colo, the large data center, you see a lot of compute structure, a lot of storage. An availability set is the ability for you to spin up, say, 2 VMs that are load balanced, that say they're your front-end web application. Well, if you put them in an availability set, one VM will exist in one row of Microsoft's data center. The other VM will exist in another row across the room within the same data center. So the thing to keep in mind about sets is it protects against that one row failure or that rack that maybe loses power or goes down. That other VM will continue to run. It's also used, like a lot of times Microsoft may need to do work on a cabinet or a rack, or maybe the colo needs to, whatever's happening there. Availability set is a nice way to protect your VMs. However, it is within the data center only.
Yeah, so availability zones take care of the issue that availability sets bring, as in if that data center where your infrastructure lives, even though you're in availability set, if that data center goes down, then you're going to see that outage. Now, with Azure regions, there's multiple data centers per region, right? So with availability zones, now I can say, I want my infrastructure in 2 different data centers. I want it in 3 different data centers, right? So you're replicating all of that between those data centers. Now, there is still a risk to Azure zones due to, let's say you're in Northern California, so West US, and there is a large earthquake that hits that knocks that all out. Then essentially, if you're in availability zones and that zone goes down, then you will experience that outage. That brings us to the next slide, which is going to be region pairs. So essentially what a region pair does is Microsoft's failover mechanism for zone outages, right? So it is very critical to pick the region from the beginning that is automatically paired with a different region. So not all regions have region pairs, I guess. So I go back to the example of West US. I know that all my infrastructure in West US is in a region pair with East US automatically. Microsoft, in case of an outage, will fail over all of your infrastructure to that East region. Now, there's some gotchas to that, right? So you have to set up your infrastructure in a geo-redundant way. That way, it actually does fail over. Otherwise, if you're locally redundant and that data center goes out, then you will experience the outage as well. So this definitely helps with when Microsoft runs updates, they're able to shift all of your resources. Now, the thing with this is, don't think of this as Microsoft has me backed up. I don't need to implement any type of DR into another region. That's false. So you have zero control over this. You pretty much don't know when it happens, and if it does happen, you don't know. There's no way of having any back-end connectivity. There's other services that are out there as far as Azure Backup and Site Recovery that will handle that for you, with Azure Backup being able to restore to a different region, and then ASR handling that automatically for you.
So I'll kick us off with storage replication types. So you got that geo replication, as Josh was describing. You also have local replication and then zone replication. So depending on how available you need your storage, you might pick one of these. There is a cost difference between having local redundancy versus geo-regional redundancy. And you can see the durability at the bottom there. Your 11 nines versus 12 nines, 16 nines. And then so just keep in mind, and if you wanted to understand like pricing around this, again, I'd direct you back to the Azure Online Calculator. If you put in storage, you have an opportunity to select one of these redundancy options and then see what that cost would be for your storage, and understand whether that would be worth protecting your data through that type of redundancy. The types of storage within Azure, we have blobs, tables, queues, disks, and files. They're all used for slightly different types of data. Blobs are highly scalable. You can also share a lot of information outside your organization with a blob using what's called a SAS token. Tables are great for that, storing that traditional structured data like a database. Queues are temporary storage for things like your Azure functions. Disks, you would attach those to your VM. So when you create a VM within Azure, it's automatically going to create a disk for that VM, and you will see that within your resources in your subscription. And of course, files, that is like your on-prem file server. However, that is within Azure. You can mount those files to your local computer like you would any other file share.
Yeah, so Azure Blob is the main type of storage, the typical type of storage that you're going to select when creating a storage account. You can use a blob pretty much for almost anything. So a big case for using blob storage is you're going to be storing your backups for restore, disaster recovery, archiving. Another example of that is let's say that you're a content host and you want to utilize that CDN. You're going to store all of your images, your videos inside that blob and be able to open that up directly in a browser and be able to store those files. Doing data for analysis, so ingesting any type of data from on-prem into Azure, it's going to land into a blob. If you're doing it as a DR site, so you have on-prem backup and you want to extend that to Azure, you're going to go and set up a blob as well for that. And then also, like I was saying, all of this is accessible via the web, so there is security mechanisms in place to be able to prevent and provide access either for a timing mechanism from a certain IP address, even using Azure Active Directory as like NTFS permissions, essentially.
Yep. And I would add, blobs are great also if you've got application developers that need access to that storage. There are REST APIs that they can write against and connect to storage for that application as well. Azure Files, as I mentioned before, this is your SMB file share. When you create a storage account, which would be the first thing you do, then you're going to go ahead and select the services within that storage account that you want to operate on. So whether it's your blobs or your files, you can extend your Active Directory into your files. So when you select files and go and set this up within your storage account, the next thing you might do is turn on Active Directory for that. And now you can use what's very similar to NTFS permissions and supply security groups to your folders within the files for access control.
Yeah, and one of the big questions that we do get when going through migrations is, hey, we have this file server. What are we going to do with our file server? So essentially what we could do is come in there and set up, there's different types of moving data in and out of Azure, all the way from I have 100 gigs to I have 100 terabytes. So there's different solutions that get your data up there. So Typically, though, with your file servers, depending on how you're using Azure Active Directory or not, we could essentially turn Azure files into your new file server. You get rid of that virtual machine that's running, so now you're running in PAS rather than IaaS, right? We're able to go in there and set NTFS permissions, and it's extremely simple to connect these Azure file shares as a drive on a machine. It's one little line that you run that will connect it, so now your K drive is now presenting itself as it normally did on-prem. It's stored in Azure. It's being backed up. You don't have the virtual machine to worry about anymore.
If you needed someone to have access outside your organization, you can generate a SAS token. The SAS token, you can set it up so that it has a expiration on it. So this person is coming from this IP address. You want to set them up with the files. You give them a SAS token. They put it into a browser. They have access to your files. They can download whatever they need there. Then that would expire, say, within 2 hours, and then that SAS token is no longer available to anyone until you regenerate a new one. So a lot of different connection options for files, both internally and externally to your organization.
Yeah, so a few other types of Azure storage options that you have available are going to be queue, table, and managed disk. So starting off with queue, it's a service that's used to store and retrieve messages, essentially. So an example I've used, if we had electronic voting, right now everyone would be sending in, their votes. They're coming in thousands of messages every single minute. We're going to queue those up, and then we're going to have a piece of software or another Azure service that is going to pull that out of that queue and store that possibly in a table that CosmoDB is now able to go and query for any type of database queries that you would need to do, or basically, optimizing that data now to be able to serve the results. The next piece to that would be a managed disk. This is attached to a virtual machine. So anytime that you create a virtual machine, you're essentially creating a managed disk. Also, if you add any extra disk to that, that's what that's going to be as well. So there are lots of benefits to managed disks as far as backup goes, encryption goes, etc. Yeah, so here's another table that kind of shows you, breaks that down when you would actually be using these. So Azure files, as you can see, you're doing that lift and shift. You need to get things from your server into Azure. That's where you're going to pretty much bring in those files there. Bring the files into Azure files. Sorry, that gets confusing. Azure blobs, you want to stream some videos. You're a content provider. You need to be able to access that data from virtually anywhere. You're building something like a data lake where you need to store that data and then bring it into something like Synapse or whatnot. And then disks are all part of an Azure virtual machine. So looking at the storage tiers, every storage tier is a little bit different in its way. So there are 3 tiers. You have hot, you have cold, and you have archive, right? So your hot tier is going to be the one that you access most frequently. So this is something that is getting the files loaded into it possibly every day, maybe every other day, whatever it is. So the storage cost is always going to be the highest when choosing the hot, but the access cost is going to be the lowest because it's right there. Cold is essentially kind of we're going to maybe pull files or put files in there every month, every other month. We'll possibly have all of our backups. So when we set up Azure as a DR site, most of your storage is getting set up in a cold because typically, not as a DR site, but as a third party. Not a third party, but drawing a blank here. An extra layer of backup, sorry. So we're taking our backups from on-prem. We're storing them also in Azure.
Target, right?
Yeah, another target, sorry. It's going into the cold. Otherwise, if it's going in the hot, we're paying for hot and it's backups, right? We're hopefully not pulling from backups every single day. And then you also have the archive. So the archive, I explain it as tapes. It's not really tapes. But it's the easiest way to think about it, right? So there is a time frame, though, that Microsoft gives you for getting you that data. It is at least a couple hours for them to get you that data. Storage is extremely cheap, but the cost to pull that data out is a lot more than what it would be hot. And part of that kind of the way that plays, going back to the whole backup thing, is essentially you have that cold. We're able to move data between these certain tiers. So something could come in as hot after, a month of it not being touched, move it to cold, and then we need to save this for 5 years for compliance issues or whatever it is. Let's move it to archive for longer term storage.
So before we get to database services, one more thing on storage. If you've never set up storage and you're interested in doing that, the first thing you're going to want to do is create a storage account. You could have an entire deployment with one storage account. You can have all the flavors of storage that we went over within that storage account. So if you go to your Azure portal, create that storage account, you'll see options for creating file shares. You'll see options for creating blobs, for SAS tokens. You can secure that storage account through firewalling and ACL. So all of your security mechanisms are within that storage account. So keep in mind, the storage account is the container for which all of these products live. So when you go and create that, then you'll go in and go ahead and create your file shares and your blobs. And I wanted to mention that because I didn't want you to be surprised when you went to do this, that the files, it's not there in the marketplace as a product. You do need a storage account, and then you can go ahead and create these items. So Josh is going to cover database services for us.
Yeah, so Azure offers a few different database services as a PaaS service, right? So essentially, when you're looking at migrating SQL to Azure, you're looking at, can we get this database into a PaaS type hosted solution, and is there going to be any gotchas when it comes to going into PaaS, right? A lot of SQL databases on-prem use security from users there, so it's all NTFS permissions. They're assigning permissions within that database to owners. So you have to make sure that you have Active Directory up and running correctly in order to be able to successfully move that database with permissions and whatnot. So Microsoft offers a few different ways of moving into the PaaS type of hosted environment, one of them being a managed instance. So Microsoft basically takes care of the whole SQL server for you and makes it very easy to move into. A single database is, I just have one single database. Possibly it's for a website that's running a static website. I don't need to have the real high availability, even though Microsoft is providing that for you. It's a single hosted database, so you're not worrying about any of the back end. You're not really working with the managed instance like you would with that. And then you have the Elastic Pool, which is a collection of single databases. So if you have a database, like Chris was saying earlier, with the scale set of a company and coming into the holidays, right? They're going to be getting a lot of traffic. So you're able to scale up automatically with those Elastic Pools. And then you do also have the classic, I'm going to install SQL on a virtual machine running as IaaS. So that is also available as well. That's obviously the beefier, more expensive route to go. So if we could essentially get off that into a PaaS type, then that's the way that we would like to go.
Also, with your SQL admins, they will find no difference in the look and feel of this SQL versus the one that they're using, say, on-prem or on a VM. When they load their SQL management tools and load in this database, it's going to look and feel exactly like it did on their traditional SQL server. And permissions, SA permissions, all those types of items are there. T-SQL statements are available, so it has the exact same feel that it would, from your traditional or legacy on-prem SQL.
And so Azure Cosmos DB. So when you select SQL, you're selecting SQL and it's landing in a region, right? And if you have an application, you need that application to live close to that database. So your queries, you don't experience that latency. Azure Cosmos DB is more so a globally distributed database model. So essentially, your database lives cached around the world. So think about that as perfect example is a computer game, right? You're not going to have a computer game that has one region, one area of users. It's going to be global users accessing that computer or that game, and you need to have the lowest latency possible. So as you can see there, it's guaranteed that you have the 99th percentile worldwide of low latency. Just something you're not going to experience with SQL. So this is where Microsoft comes in. It's really powerful, works very well. It allows you to really expand your global presence. So big data and analytics. So Microsoft, obviously, or Azure, this is, a very big thing for them, very big thing for a lot of companies these days. So they offer a few different services. We have three called out from right on the slide here. So we have Azure Synapse, which is an analytics service that brings together the data warehousing and big data analytics. That's where you're going to get all of the information about what's living within your data lake storage. So your data lake storage is basically reduces the time to insights. It's highly scalable. That's where a lot of your data is going to live. And then you have the data factory, which helps you construct the ETLs and the ELT processes, all code free without you worrying about any of the infrastructure. So looking at the graphic here, you can see that there's various ways of ingesting data. Maybe you're looking at a Twitter feed and you're constantly pulling in the data that's coming in there. Maybe you have IoT devices, so you own a fleet of cars and you have those cars constantly using 4G to send you the data. All of that data is being ingested, it's being stored, it's being prepped, and then it's serving it. So those three services on the left side there are exactly what you're going to use to be able to provide those insights to your applications and your data.
So RBAC. So very important. We've got our Azure deployment going, and we need some kind of role-based access controls. And we're going to walk through what those roles are and what those controls are. So what is RBAC? It's role-based access and control. It allows access with sometimes very granular permissions if you need them. We had talked earlier about management groups and setting role-based access through a management group in a hierarchy form, having it trickle down to your subscriptions, and then everything under that management group, you have control, whether it's, you're a network contributor or you're a storage reader or some type of role that you have within the organization. You can provide very granular permissions to resources as well. Let's say that if I'm a application owner and I just work in one VM, but I need to get on that VM, I could have access to only that resource. Or if I'm an admin of a section of my company and I only need access to a particular resource group and the resources within that, that might be a way to look at how I would do RBAC and establish that connection there. And thinking about RBAC and how you set your resources up is really important. For example, if you've got a lot of different departments and you have a networking group, well, maybe you want to create a resource group that's for all your networks, and you put all your VNets and your NSGs in that. Now you, through granular permissions, can give access to your networking team to simply that resource group. So you can assign RBAC to subscriptions. We recommend management groups, resource groups, or resources. There are a lot of built-in roles to choose from. Most people don't need to do custom roles, but usually the roles that are built into Azure are enough for really any small or even large organization to take advantage of. So when we think about doing RBAC and when we go through that governance workshops with our clients and set this up, we do a lot of interviewing with, okay, who are the people that are going to be accessing Azure? Who is the admin team? And then, of course, who's in charge of billing and all the different areas of Azure that we need to give people permissions and access to. So some of the RBAC roles, and when we think about that, we think about least privilege. So when we, down the left-hand side there, you see the Azure RBAC role and cost management reader. Well, that's someone that just needs to view the billing within Azure. However, a cost managed contributor, they would create budgets and alerts on those budgets within Azure. So depending on who you are and what your role is, there is a role within Azure for that person, a billing reader. Then we have our big three. You got your reader, your contributor, and your owner. These three roles can be assigned to a management group and the entire Azure deployment, or reader, contributor, owner can be assigned to simply networks or storage or any piece of Azure that person or group might need access to.
Hey, Chris. I have a question going back a couple slides regarding SQL databases. Can I move any size of SQL database into Azure?
Great question. No, you can't just move any size, right? You're not going to come bring a 10 terabyte database into the Elastic pool type thing. There are limitations. What that number is, I will have to look and find out for you. I'm not sure on the exact number. It's going to change per how you deploy SQL, right? So if you're looking at doing it as SQL in a virtual machine, you're limited to the device or the disk that you select, right? Obviously, the bigger the database, I'm going to guess a lot more people are accessing that. So you want to have that latency. You want to have those disks available so you're not experiencing that latency. So SSDs at least, they now offer different disks for faster type databases.
And depending on the database, that might not be the right product. Maybe it's Cosmos DB that you need to move into, or, whether it's structured or unstructured data, it would depend on the database, of course. But
yeah. I'll pull up the exact number of what the limitations are.
Good question. Yeah.
Great. And then another question on, I think, the section after big data. So going back to components of big data, do you recommend using orchestration, previously Data Factory, in Synapse, or Data Factory outside of Synapse?
We have big data people here at Burwood that work with this service all the time. And I know that with Synapse kind of having that rename, it's taken on a lot of the other products as well, the other services. So we can definitely get an answer for you as far as what's the best way of architecting that so your data moves freely, and they definitely have the experience with doing that.
It's a big subject. We have an entire department devoted to this. So let's get your name, and we'll get you a really good answer to that.
Exactly. Yeah, I would rather have the guy who does this all day, every day, work with you on coming up with that correct process there.
It's an awesome question. Yeah. Okay, back to RBAC roles. So as we're looking at role-based access, we got our roles going across the top, our reader, contributor, for example, owner, and then you can see within the scope what these roles do. So your reader, they're going to be your observers. It's a read-only. Contributor, you can manage the resources. Your owners are the admins. So what does that mean? Well, that means your owner is the person that can assign reader roles and assign contributor roles. They can even assign other owners if they want. So owner is a kind of a big deal in RBAC. That's a very powerful role to have. You want very few of those, and you want most everyone within Azure doing things in Azure to be under the reader or contributor role. So the big thing for us is reducing the number of global admins. So this gets a little confusing, I think, when you talk about RBAC and what a global admin actually is. The global administrator is the role automatically given to the person that starts your Azure tenant within your organization. What can the global admin do? Global admin can assign owners, contributors, readers. They have access to everything. This is like an enterprise admin within your on-prem Active Directory. Global admins, funny enough, and this is where I think the confusion gets. It sounds like a big, and it is. It's a big role to have. However, global admins by themselves cannot go spin, say, virtual machines up in a subscription within the Azure side. All they can really do is assign roles to other users. So before a global admin, if I start a tenant, I'm automatically a global admin. That means I can start assigning permissions. Well, if I needed to spin up resources in Azure like VNets or virtual machines, I would have to give myself the owner or contributor role to allow myself the ability to do that. So don't confuse global admins with owners. Owners are different things. That's actually sort of rubber meets the road. You can now spin stuff up. Global admins are powerful because they have ability to assign roles to users, including that owner role. So owner and global admin are two different things, really. If the 65 or so out-of-the-box roles within Azure aren't meeting your requirements, you can create a RBAC custom role. Here we have a JSON with that role defined, and here we have a role where the compute virtual machines, I've created a role here where this person can start and restart virtual machines, and that's it. They can't spin up virtual machines. This is all the capability they have within this role. So there are options for you if the roles within Azure currently aren't meeting your requirements. You can always create a custom role, and this is one of the ways you can do it through code.
Yeah, and typically you're going to run into this. Let's say we're trying to follow least privileged access, right? So we have networking guys come in and we assign them a network role. They are only going to be able to touch networking type items. But let's say we need them to be able to go out and stand up firewalls or just virtual machines. We could either assign them those individual roles, multiple roles to the same user, or we can come in here and customize one that would provide that access of something that another built-in role wouldn't provide. There are tons of roles out there, so there really isn't a role that's named right now that isn't going to give you access. So making a custom role is it's pretty rare, but it is available.
Yeah, thanks. All right, DevOps.
Yeah, so Azure DevOps. So as everyone in today's world has been seeing, DevOps has been extremely crucial when coming into cloud type environments. Developers now have the ability to go and stand up infrastructure right away. They are able to, stand up infrastructure pulling from a Git repository, setting up Kanban boards. This is all available within the DevOps services, and we'll break that down within the next slide here. Another way of preventing developers from going in and setting up anything they want is something like Dev Test Lab. So I'm able to go in there, provide a developer access, say, these are the only SKUs that you can use. This is where you have to do it, which region. And it's a very cheap way of being able to test, stand up machines, take them down, etc. So on the next slide here, we break down the Azure DevOps and what it has to offer. So one of the first things is repos. So as you know, Microsoft owns GitHub, so most developers are going to have a lot of their information in GitHub or other repositories. And you're able to use that as your source control. So also bringing in any type of foundation type servers as well. You have pipelines, Azure pipelines, which give you the ability to build and release services in a continuous integration, delivery of apps. So we have an app that's pre-production, and then it goes into alpha, and then it goes into production type thing. Azure boards. So think of this as a Kanban board, Scrum methods, you know it all. They have their version of that, which is Azure Boards. You could use this as a SaaS version. You can bring this right into Teams, many other different ways of using that. Azure Test Plans, so kind of coming into the whole pipelines scenario there, allows you to test your applications. One of those is something like a DDoS attack, right? So I want to know what's going to happen to my application if we get DDoSed, or if 20 gigs of data comes in at once, what's going to happen? So we're able to test that and make sure that it's working. And then artifacts, right? So you're able to use NuGet packages and really integrate this into your CI/CD pipeline. So as I was explaining just a few minutes ago, Azure DevOps, Dev Test Labs, enables the developers on teams to self-manage their virtual machines, right, and PaaS resources. Typically, if you give a developer full access to Azure, they're going to go and, oh, this looks nice, ooh, this looks nice, and start spinning up a lot of things. So this is how you keep them in a lab type environment, right? You're creating usable templates. So say you create a template that is connected to your Active Directory. It has certain tools installed on it, applications, and you can quickly reuse those over and over again. And then it also integrates with your pipeline, right? So once everything works out in dev tests, you like what you're seeing, you could essentially push that to your pipeline there.
One of the things we like to deploy is infrastructure as code. this is a way to deliver stable, consistent environments. You can see your code, obviously. You can make corrections within your code, but when you run that code, you are deploying the same thing over and over again. What that does is it can do everything from decrease your costs within Azure, making sure that tagging is correct in Azure. There's a lot of things that infrastructure as code can do. We mentioned blueprints earlier. Well, you can create your own blueprint within your code. By doing that, you can spin up VNets. You can review your code before you launch it. With Terraform, which we'll go over in a minute, you can test your code to make sure that it's going to do what you expect it to. Variable and definition files within that code allow you to maybe give this, have a internal customer, say, answer some questions about what they need for their application, and maybe it's the app dev department. They basically fill out your variables and definition files for you. Then you reference those files within your code, and then launch that code against Azure. A few ways this can be done. As I mentioned, Terraform is a big one that we use at Burwood. PowerShell is another way to go. You can use the bash scripting within Azure as well, and then save all that code on your desktop and run it when you need it.
Yeah, and ARM templates are the other big thing to this, right? Yeah, so if you're not using a Terraform type infrastructure as a code, then typically you're going to move into ARM templates. And ARM templates do exactly what Chris was just mentioning there. We're able to go in there and set up a template for a small deployment, for a large deployment. I've had ARM templates that I've deployed that have taken 3 hours to kick off, run, deploy the whole deal, but then it's deploying, over 100 different resources. So I spent the time to develop the template, but then you're hitting go and all of that's happening. To do all that manually would really increase your time for deployment. So you're able to templatize this, have your variable set, and all of this is stored directly within Azure.
If you were on the webinar when I did my demonstration of the portal, you can see how long it actually takes to click through to create a VNet, create my subnets within the portal, click next, validation, finish. With this code, all of that is built in, you run it, and your VNet is there.
Yeah, and just as we said about the big data earlier, we do have a separate team of DevOps engineers that handle this and help companies really establish that infrastructure as code, get those templates built out, and really figure out what that solution is going to be moving forward.
Well, this is an example of Terraform. Why might you use this? It's pretty easy to read, and I think if you just take a minute and look at the screen here, you can see what's happening. This is a compute instance that I'm spinning up. I've got variables in the type of compute I want, the zone that I want this in, the image, the size of the machine type. Everything that Azure is going to be expecting is built into this Terraform code. All the variables live in another file that I have that's within the path to this Terraform folder. You can deploy this in Visual Studio Code. I think is probably my favorite deployment method. You're going to load Terraform into Visual Studio Code, connect to your Azure instance, your Azure deployment, and then you can start to create these Terraform. And what you can do, as Josh was mentioning, is really spin up a lot of stuff really fast. So, if you can plan your whole deployment out, draw it out, create the Terraform, now it's simply checking your Terraform code first and then running it, and all of those assets that you created within that code will be spun up in Azure really rather quickly. So that's the end of our presentation, and we wanted to thank you and give you some key takeaways from the presentation. So one, of course, get yourself that free Azure account and set up a subscription and try some of the things that we mentioned today. Try spinning up that storage and spin up some blob and, give your friend a SAS token and see if they can access, a PDF or whatever within that blob. Try some VMs and VNets and do some peering. It's actually a lot of fun to get in there and do that. If you want, try some Terraform. You can't hurt anything by doing that. It's a free account, very easy to set up. Also, establish your Azure governance and security foundation before you deploy to Azure. It's a great key. So make sure that one thing that we didn't touch on too much, was naming conventions. That's in our governance workshop. But when you have a lot of people, or even a few people, 3 people within your Azure deployment, spinning up resources, they're all going to name a VNet something different. So you want to get a handle on that. And even a single person will spin up a VNet a different way every time they go into Azure. So making sure that you have naming conventions and tagging and things of that nature established before you get assets provisioned within Azure is super important. And then finally, start to identify workloads and think about your own on-prem deployment and what workloads could be repurposed, say, for PaaS services. And we talked about that SQL instance. So what databases might you be able to move into Cosmos DB or that Elastic pool within SQL? So thinking about that, and it takes a lot of planning, but if you start just moving down that road, you'll be surprised at how quickly you can get into Azure and get workloads spun up.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. What a great session. And we've had such wonderful engagement. So thank you all on the call for asking such great questions throughout. Not too late to pop any final questions in. We have about 15 minutes left. And I do already have a few questions for you, Chris and Josh. So let's see. One from Rajat. Are Microsoft Teams and Skype working on Azure?
Well, let's start off with Teams and Skype. Skype is going end of life July 2021. So if you are still on Skype for business, on-prem, or within Microsoft 365 or O365, you will need to get to Teams. Does Teams run on Azure? Teams is a service that runs on, the back end is Azure, right? Same with Office 365. It's all in the same data centers. So it is treated as a separate service, though. So what I mean by that is that I can go and establish a Teams presence without setting up an Azure subscription. But what I can't do is establish that Teams presence without having Office 365 licenses, right? So when you do establish Office 365, what happens? You move into Azure AD. So it all kind of plays together in the back end. So is Teams on Azure? Yes, it is. Skype, we're going to stop talking about Skype because you need to get to Teams ASAP. We can help you out with that.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh.
Yep.
All right. Can that exact Terraform code be reused for other cloud platforms?
Yes and no. So the structure is there, but the variables are a little different. So when you're thinking about provisioning code between GCP and Azure, the idea is there, but GCP has just different naming for things. So if you're going to provision a firewall or a VNet, you're going to find it won't be a VNet. It's going to be a VCP. So if you know Terraform, the next thing that you just need to do is understand, what would you call it, like the building blocks of that cloud platform and understanding their naming conventions for things. But it follows along the same premise, which is having that variable file, having your main script. That's all consistent throughout the cloud platforms, but what you call things in the platform will be slightly different.
Yeah, and when you're looking at multi-cloud architecture, so if we're looking at GCP and Azure, AWS and Azure, and having infrastructure in both of those, we won't even look at deployment without using infrastructure as a code when it comes to that. Just due to, with going in and changing some names, we can use those templates pretty much over and over again, or be able to deploy resources at the same time, from the same exact script as well.
Great. All right, next one from Motion. Is there any recycle bin in Azure or any rollback or store option that can be used in case I need to recover deleted resources?
Yes and no. So depending on what level of resource are you talking about. Is it a file? Yes, you probably can recover that, depending on it's soft delete, hard delete, if you have Azure backup running or not. Did you go in and delete a VNet? You deleted that VNet. You're going to have to go in and recreate that, yeah.
I would add to that. You need to bring your own backup and recovery. Azure's not doing that out of the box. So if you've got files, you need to back those up. just mentioning that because they're not protecting necessarily your data. They're hosting it for you, but you definitely need to be backing that up.
Yeah, they're not protecting your data in a way of a backup, right? They're giving you that high availability if you set yourself up with the region pairs. But they offer, like I mentioned earlier, Azure Backup, which will give you VM-level snapshot restores. So you can say, hey, I want one restore every day. I want them 3 times a day. And you can restore individual files from those snapshots. You could also set it up to where you're installing the agent, the Mars agent, on a virtual machine and having much better granular control over what lives on that machine, so like a typical type of backup would be. And then you have something like ASR, which is going to provide you that full DR failover to a different region where you have full control over that. I could go in there and say, hey, I want to fail over this workload right now to the east because I don't like it running in the west, so I'm moving it to the east. So that's a possibility there. So yes, you are moving resources into Azure, but you still have to go in there and enable a backup in DR.
Got it. Clarification on that one from Motion. Are you saying like a deleted virtual machine or any other resource configuration, like VPN gateway configuration?
So VPN gateway configuration, if you were to configure a VPN gateway and go in there and delete that gateway, you would have to recreate that gateway again. If you deleted a virtual machine and you did not have Azure Backup on that virtual machine, then you would need to recreate that virtual machine again, yes. Now, if you're looking at something like Azure AD, there is a recycle bin in there. So everything that's deleted from that will end up in a recycle bin.
I guess the answer is
okay.
It depends, right? It all depends.
All right, a couple more here. Can you get older Windows and SQL builds in Azure when spinning up a new VM?
So I believe they offer 2016 and 2019 as far as Windows VMs go. So when you go to stand up a VM, that's what you are limited to. Now, as far as SQL versions, with any type of paths, you are moving into the latest SQL version that there is. If you're going into IaaS, then if you want to install SQL 2005, sure, go ahead, but probably you want to install the latest and greatest. Now, as far as like operating systems, yes, you can migrate machines that are 2008 into Azure. It's going to extend the support lifetime for another 3 years. I believe that started last June, I want to say. I could be wrong. So it would be another 2 years that 2008 would be receiving updates within Azure. If you're running anything earlier than 2008, we need to have a conversation about that because that's a huge security risk, and we would not even think about moving anything earlier into that or even try it. We would completely repurpose that application or server, yeah.
Great. All right, and I have one final question on here in the chat. I feel like I have to preface this with, I swear I did not plant this question because it feels like a summary type of thing, but someone has asked, why should I choose Azure versus AWS or GCP?
That is a great question. Why? So I personally, I'll answer this as a personal question, feel that each one of the cloud providers do a little something better than the other, right? So GCP, very high ed, analytical, big data, handle it very well. Trying to get your users in the GCP, it's not going to be as easy as Azure AD, right? Now, if you're looking at AWS, AWS is very well known for developers, big type websites, big type, Facebook type websites, lots of visitors, even though Facebook hosts their own, but you kind of get what I'm saying there, where Microsoft really has that in with companies because a lot of companies today are going to have some type of Microsoft in their environment, most likely Active Directory, and they're signing EAs. Microsoft is baking all of this Azure spend into EAs. It is also very, very easy to set up infrastructure, Azure Active Directory infrastructure and be able to set up the hybrid connections much easier than the other clouds would be able to. What's your personal?
If you're already a Microsoft shop.
Yeah, exactly.
It is so easy to get connected to Azure and get your Active Directory syncing with Office 365, get your Azure subscription going. I would say if you're not DevOps, if you're a smaller IT shop and you're centric around Microsoft Active Directory, Microsoft servers, Azure is probably an easy transition for you. They also have all of the goodies that GCP and AWS has. So I would also extend the Office 365 and Teams are really compelling. We use that at Burwood. Great collaboration tools. I feel like we all really like it. And so just having those tools and the transition from Exchange into Office 365, I think there's a natural progression going into creating a subscription and running Azure workloads within the infrastructure.
Great. All right, and I think we have time for one more. One more just popped in the chat. I think this is a good one. So last question, what is the main pitch for Azure versus IBM or Oracle solutions, and why shouldn't the client consider a hybrid multi-vendor cloud as well?
So it kind of relates to the last question, except it's two different vendors, right? IBM and Oracle. So I personally have not dealt with much IBM cloud. My experience lies mainly with GCP, AWS, and Azure. And that is a big talking topic for a lot of companies these days is multi-cloud architecture, right? So why do I have to go with one single cloud? What if that company has an outage, which we all know that it's extremely possible, right? A huge wide outage as far as server infrastructure going down, that typically doesn't happen. It's something like Microsoft just had the whole Azure AD piece go down. So that kind of puts a lot of bad taste for people to choose which cloud they're going to go into. Every cloud provider is going to have outages. Now, the whole Oracle piece, so it always comes back to, I feel like, the Oracle licensing for that. Are you able to run your Oracle databases in Azure? If you are, then great. Otherwise, you're going to have to go to Oracle Cloud. So that usually comes down to licensing and whatnot within each company. And then IBM, like I said, I personally don't have much experience with IBM to be able to kind of talk on that. But it is something that is coming up in a lot of conversations, the whole multi-cloud architecture, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Josh. All right. Well, that is all the questions we have, and we have 3 minutes to spare. So I think we will go ahead and wrap up for today. Again, I want to say, of course, thank you, Chris and Josh, for presenting for us today and training all of us. And thank you, everyone on the line. Appreciate you hanging in there, and I really hope this has been informative and helpful for you all. And again, really appreciate your engagement. Some awesome questions throughout this session. As Chris and Josh mentioned a couple times, they live and breathe every day Microsoft Azure, helping our clients with cloud technology and enablement. We would love to talk to you if this workshop was helpful, and a deeper dive for your organization or IT team would be helpful. We can do custom options, everything from a deeper dive of this course that's more hands-on, lab-based for your team, something specific to governance and security, like Chris and Josh mentioned early on. We would be glad to talk about options. Also, if you have any specific questions or follow-ups you want to address based on any questions you asked today, their contact info is here on the screen. I am sure they would be happy to chat with you offline. Lastly, once you close this webinar, you'll get a survey pop-up. We would love your feedback on how helpful this was for you. There's also a couple questions on any future topics you would recommend. We love to do educational events like this, so if anything else you'd love to learn about from a partner like Burwood, please let us know, and we would be glad to host another event. So any final words, Chris and Josh?
Just thank you so much for spending the day with us. We had a lot of fun, and thank you.
Yep, thank you all for attending, and all have a great day.
Yeah, further questions, please hit us up on email. We're really responsive. We'll get right back to you. So, yeah, thanks.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thank you, everyone, for joining Burwood, and have a wonderful afternoon. See ya.
Bye. See ya.